I trusted my own son with everything: my home, my money, my heart. But one decision revealed a truth so dark it nearly killed us. What I discovered wasn't betrayal. It was a carefully planned murder disguised as love. And by the time I realized it, I was already standing at the edge of a cliff. My name is Hilda. I'm 60 years old, and until 3 days ago, I believed I understood my family. I believed I knew the people I raised, the home I built, and the life I lived for 40 years. I was wrong about all of it. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how the people closest to you can wear love like a disguise, and how the truth can stay buried for decades, waiting for the worst possible moment to surface. Richard and I spent most of our lives building something simple and honest. We lived in a quiet neighborhood where mornings smelled like coffee and freshly cut grass. I taught children at the local elementary school, and Henry worked with his hands, crafting furniture so sturdy it felt permanent, like he was trying to build something that would outlast us. We had 2 sons. Richard was our firstborn, full of warmth and laughter. He was the kind of boy who helped without being asked, who defended his younger brother even when Damien didn't deserve it. Damien was quieter, more withdrawn. He watched more than he spoke. I told myself that didn't mean anything. Mothers make excuses because mothers have to believe. Our family routines felt sacred. Sunday dinners around the oak table Henry carved himself. Evening walks where we talked about retirement, grandchildren, and growing old together. On the surface, it was a life many people would envy, but perfect-looking lives hide cracks better than broken ones. When Richard turned 20, something shifted. He and Damien began arguing in hushed voices. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Henry told me it was normal. Brothers clash, then grow out of it. I chose to believe him because believing was easier than asking questions. Then, one October night, Richard never came home. We waited. 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 in the morning. Damien stayed in his room, claiming he was studying, but there was something unsettling about his calm. Henry went out with neighbors to search. At dawn, they found Richard at the bottom of a gorge near the river. The police said it was an accident. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Grief leaves no room for suspicion. At Richard's funeral, I collapsed into Henry's arms, while Damien stood motionless, eyes dry, face unreadable. I told myself everyone mourns differently. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true. After that, Damien changed, or at least that's what it looked like. He became attentive, helpful, gentle. He filled the empty space Richard left behind so perfectly that I mistook guilt for devotion. Years passed. The pain dulled but never disappeared. Damien married Melissa, a woman with a soft voice and careful smiles. They had children. Life seemed to offer us a second chance at happiness. I believed the worst was behind us. But happiness built on lies doesn't last. 6 months ago, Damien suggested we update our will. He said it was practical, responsible, loving. He and Melissa insisted they only wanted to protect us. I ignored the chill that ran through me when Melissa squeezed my hand and said, "We'll always take care of you." Something about the way she said always didn't feel like love. I didn't know then that this was the moment everything truly began to unravel, that the past I buried was about to claw its way back into the light, and that my own son was already planning the end of my story. Because the night Henry finally told me the truth about Richard's death, I realized our family tragedy never ended. It was only paused. After Damien suggested updating our will, something invisible shifted inside our home. Nothing dramatic at first, just a change in atmosphere, like the air before a storm. Conversations felt measured, smiles lingered a second too long, and every visit from Damien and Melissa suddenly had a purpose. They began coming over more often. At first, I welcomed it. I told myself they missed us, that they wanted the children to spend time with their grandparents. But slowly, their visits turned into inspections. Melissa commented on our furniture, the house layout, the size of the yard. Damien asked questions about utility costs, insurance policies, and the value of Henry's workshop equipment. None of it sounded openly malicious. It was framed as concern, practicality, responsibility. Still, my unease grew. At the lawyer's office, Damien did most of the talking. He suggested that everything be left to him and Melissa directly, claiming it would make things simpler for the grandchildren later. He said we need help as we aged, that having access to our finances would allow him to care for us properly. Henry nodded along. He always trusted easily, especially when it came to our son. I hesitated. Something in my chest tightened when I signed those papers. I remember Melissa hugging me afterward, whispering, "Now we're officially family forever." Her words felt less like comfort and more like a seal closing shut. In the weeks that followed, the pressure increased. They suggested selling the house, said it was too big for people our age. Melissa even mentioned apartments she'd looked into for us. Small, efficient places, far from the memories I treasured. When I refused, Damien's tone changed. "Mom, you're being unrealistic," he said one afternoon, irritation flashing across his face before disappearing behind a forced smile. "This place isn't safe for you anymore." Safe. The word echoed in my mind, because nothing about their sudden concern felt safe. One night, I asked Henry if he noticed how obsessed Damien had become with our money. Henry brushed it off, but I saw doubt flicker in his eyes, a doubt he didn't want to face. Then came the next request, power of attorney. Damien explained it calmly, logically. What if one of us got sick? What if paperwork needed to be handled quickly? Melissa nodded along, pouring tea into cups that suddenly felt like props at a performance. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called my sister Harriet. She had always been sharper than me, less forgiving of excuses. When I told her everything, she went silent. "Hilda," she finally said, "why would a financially stable man need control over his parents' money this badly?" Her words hit me like a slap. That evening, Damien came over again. This time, I confronted him. "Why is this so important to you?" I asked. "Your father and I are still capable of making our own decisions." For a brief moment, the mask slipped. His eyes hardened. The warmth vanished. What replaced it was something cold, calculating. "It's not about control. It's about responsibility." The way he said responsibility made my skin crawl. That night, Henry and I argued for the first time in years. He accused me of being paranoid. I accused him of being blind. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. As we stood in the kitchen, surrounded by decades of shared memories, I asked him something that had been haunting me. "Do you remember how Damien was before Richard died?" Henry stopped moving. He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was one I had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, recognition. "Hilda," he said quietly, "there are things about Richard's death I never told you." My heart began to pound. The past wasn't buried anymore. It was knocking. And when Henry finally sat me down and told me what he witnessed the night Richard died, I realized our son wasn't just greedy, he was dangerous. Henry sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared decades of meals, laughter, and ordinary conversations that now felt painfully distant. His hands trembled as he rubbed his face, as if trying to erase the past by touch alone. "The night Richard died," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "Damien wasn't in his room." I felt my breath catch. Henry told me he'd seen Damien leave the house that evening, tense and restless. Something about his behavior unsettled him, so he followed at a distance. He didn't want to spy on his son, but instinct told him something was wrong. They went toward the gorge. By the time Henry arrived, both boys were already there. He heard them before he saw them, shouting, accusations cutting through the dark. Richard was furious. He was holding papers, bank statements he had discovered after months of quiet investigation. Damien was stealing from us, Henry said, his voice cracking. From our savings, small amounts at first, then more. My stomach twisted. Richard had confronted his brother, threatening to tell us the truth if Damien didn't confess and return the money. According to Henry, Damien snapped. Years of resentment poured out, being the younger son, living in Richard's shadow, feeling entitled to more. Henry stopped speaking. His silence was unbearable. "What happened?" I whispered. Henry swallowed hard. Damien pushed him. Not accidentally, not in self-defense, deliberately. Henry described watching Richard stumble, arms flailing as he tried to regain balance. The ground was uneven, the night was dark, there was no second chance. Richard disappeared into the void, his scream cutting off too fast. I felt something inside me break, something deeper than grief. Henry said Damien collapsed, shaking, crying, repeating the same words over and over. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "He begged me to help him," Henry confessed. "He said he'd lose everything, his life, his family, me, if the truth came out." I stared at the man I'd loved for 40 years and saw his guilt carved into every line of his face. "You believed him," I said, though it felt like swallowing glass. "I wanted to," Henry replied. "He was my son, and Richard was already gone." Henry never told the police what he saw. He let the death be ruled an accident. He convinced himself Damien would change, that the weight of what he'd done would keep him from ever harming anyone again. But Damien didn't change. He kept stealing, quietly, methodically. Henry noticed the missing money but stayed silent. Each time he looked the other way, he became more trapped. Admitting the theft would mean admitting the murder he'd covered up. "I became his accomplice," Henry said, tears spilling freely now. "And every year that passed made it harder to tell you. I felt betrayed in ways I didn't know were possible, not just by my son, but by my husband, by time itself. That's why he's pushing so hard now," I whispered. "He needs everything." Henry nodded. "His business is failing. He's drowning in debt." Suddenly, everything made sense. The urgency, the manipulation, the pressure to control our finances. "And Melissa?" I asked. "She knows," Henry said without hesitation. "She asks too many precise questions. They've planned this together." A terrifying realization settled over me. "If he killed Richard for money," I said slowly, "what would stop him from killing us?" Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, the phone rang. Damien's voice was cheerful, excited. "Mom, Melissa and I want to do something special for your anniversary. A family trip to the mountains, just us, a peaceful hike." I looked at Henry. His face had gone pale. We both understood instantly. This wasn't a celebration. It was a setup. Because the moment Damien invited us to the mountains, we knew he wasn't planning a family memory. He was planning our deaths. After Damien ended the call, Henry and I sat in silence, the weight of his invitation pressing down on us like a verdict already decided. The mountains, a family hike, a special anniversary gift. 25 years earlier, Richard had died near a gorge. Now, Damien wanted to take us to the same kind of place. Remote, quiet, and perfect for an accident. "He's going to do it there," I whispered. "He's going to make it look the same." Henry nodded slowly. He didn't try to comfort me with false hope. We were past that stage. We were two parents who finally understood the monster we had raised and the danger we were in. For the next few days, we lived inside a performance. When Damien and Melissa visited, we smiled, we nodded, we pretended excitement about the trip. Inside, every instinct screamed to run, to cancel, to tell someone, anyone. But fear held us still. "If we refuse," Henry said one night, "they'll just try again. Maybe somewhere worse, somewhere we can't prepare." He was right. At least in the mountains, we knew what they were planning. So we decided to go, but not unprepared. Henry had an old smartphone he rarely used. The battery still held charge, and it had a voice recording app. That night, he hid it in the inner pocket of his jacket and tested it quietly. "If we survive," he said, "this will be our proof. And if we didn't, at least the truth wouldn't die with us." Before the trip, Henry rewrote part of his will. He added notes, explanations, doubts. I wrote a letter to my sister Harriet, detailing everything we had learned: Richard's death, the stolen money, the mountain invitation. We hid the letter where only she would look. Friday night felt like a goodbye. We ate dinner in silence, barely touching our food. Every object in the house seemed painfully familiar. The chipped mug Henry always used, the creak in the hallway floor, the porch light that flickered. We held each other in bed like two people memorizing the feel of one another. "If something happens," Henry whispered, "know that loving you was the best thing I ever did." I didn't trust myself to answer. Saturday morning arrived too soon. Damien showed up early, cheerful, energetic. Melissa followed behind him, glowing, carrying bags of food and smiling as if this were a picnic instead of a trap. She showed me her new camera. "I want to capture every moment," she said sweetly. I felt sick. Damien unloaded hiking gear from the car. Ropes, harnesses, first aid supplies. He talked about safety while my mind screamed that none of it was meant to protect us. On the drive to the mountains, Melissa played music and sang along. Damien drove carefully, obeying every traffic rule, as if he wanted the day to feel normal right up until the end. Henry squeezed my hand and quietly activated the recorder. When we arrived, the trailhead looked peaceful, trees swaying, birds calling, sunlight filtering through the branches. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. The hike started easy. Melissa walked ahead, snapping photos, commenting on the scenery. Damien stayed behind us, watching. Every time I turned, he smiled. After an hour, the trail grew steeper. My legs burned. Henry struggled to breathe. I realized they had planned this carefully. Wear us down, make us vulnerable. "We're almost there," said Melissa, though I knew we weren't. Then she stopped and pointed. "There," she said brightly. "That cliff has the best view. Let's go up there for photos." My blood ran cold. The cliff rose sharply above the trail, the path narrow and unstable. Loose rocks, no guardrails, a perfect place to fall. "I don't think that's safe," I said. Damien was already walking towards it. "Come on, Mom, just a few steps. Trust me." Trust. The word felt like a knife, because as we followed Damien toward that cliff, I realized this was the same walk Richard never came back from. Every step toward the cliff felt heavier than the last. The ground beneath our feet became unstable, loose gravel sliding with each movement. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain Damien could hear it. Melissa climbed ahead easily, moving with the confidence of someone who had studied this place before. Henry and I exchanged a glance. We both knew this was it. The path narrowed as we climbed higher. Trees thinned. The air felt colder, sharper. When we finally reached the top, the view opened wide. An endless valley, jagged rocks far below, and a drop so deep it made my knees tremble. In any other life, it would have been breathtaking. Melissa clapped her hands together. "Isn't this perfect?" she said, positioning herself dangerously close to the edge. "The lighting is amazing." Damien stepped behind us. I could feel him there without turning around. His presence pressed against my back like a shadow with weight. "Stand right here," Melissa instructed, pointing to a spot where the ground sloped slightly downward. "The background will look incredible." Henry squeezed my hand. The recorder was still running. We moved forward inch by inch. Melissa raised the camera. "Put your arms around each other," she said. "Smile." We did, not for her, but for each other, for 40 years of marriage, for the life we thought we had, and for the son we had already lost. The camera flashed again and again. "Just one more," Damien said, stepping closer. "Take a small step back so we can see more of the valley." A small step back meant standing directly at the edge. I felt the emptiness behind my heels, nothing but air. Time slowed. Melissa lowered the camera and the warmth drained from her face. Her smile vanished, replaced by something hard and satisfied. "This will be your last picture," she said flatly. That was when Damien lunged. His hands slammed into Henry's back, pushing us toward the void. The force was sudden, violent, nothing accidental about it. I screamed as my balance vanished, but Henry reacted faster than anyone expected. He twisted and grabbed Damien's wrist, pulling him forward with everything he had left. "If we fall," Henry roared, "you're coming with us." For a split second, all four of us teetered together, locked in a horrifying tangle of limbs and screams. Melissa dropped the camera and shrieked, trying to grab Damien, but the ground gave way beneath us. The world disappeared. We fell. The wind screamed past my ears. My body spun. I thought of Richard, of how alone he must have felt in these final moments. Then came the impact. Pain exploded through me like fire. Bones cracked. Breath vanished from my lungs. The world went dark. When awareness returned, I tasted blood. My body felt shattered, every movement sending waves of agony through me. Somewhere nearby, I heard groaning, Damien's voice, Melissa crying out in pain. We had survived the fall. Barely. Then I heard Henry's voice, faint but steady. "Helda, don't move. Play dead." I didn't understand at first. The pain was unbearable. Every instinct screamed to cry out, to move, to call for help. But then I heard Damien crawling. "They're not moving," he said after a moment. His voice was strained, but not panicked. "I think they're dead." Melissa let out a breath that sounded like relief. "Good," she murmured. It worked. I forced myself to go still. I slowed my breathing until it was barely noticeable. I let my body go limp despite the agony tearing through me. A few feet away, Damien and Melissa discussed what to do next. They rehearsed their story. A rock slipped. We fell. They tried to help. Tragic accident. They laughed. Quietly, bitterly. When their voices finally faded, Henry whispered my name again. We were alive. Broken, trapped, bleeding, but alive. And that meant we still had a chance. Because lying broken at the bottom of that gorge, Henry finally told me the secret he'd carried for 25 years. And it changed everything. The silence after Damien and Melissa crawled away felt heavier than the fall itself. The forest above us swallowed their voices, leaving only the distant echo of the river and the shallow, painful rhythm of our breathing. "Hilda," Henry whispered again, barely louder than the wind moving through the rocks. "Can you move at all?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to sit up, to scream, to curse the sky. But my body felt like it belonged to someone else. Every breath sent knives through my chest. My arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, and my head throbbed like it might split open. "I'm alive," I murmured, "but I can't move much." Henry exhaled shakily. "My leg's broken, ribs too, I think, but thank God you're alive." We lay there, staring at nothing, listening for any sign that Damien might return. Minutes passed, then more. When we were certain they were gone, Henry spoke again, his voice filled with something I'd never heard before. Relief. "They think we're dead," he said. "That gives us time. Time." I didn't know how much of it we had. Blood soaked my clothes, my mouth was dry, my vision blurred whenever I tried to focus. "Henry," I whispered, "before it's too late, I need you to tell me everything. No more half-truths, no more protection." He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from a man who has been carrying a burden far too long. "The night Richard died, he came to me first."
Henry told me Richard had gone to the workshop, furious and shaking, holding proof of Damien's thefts, bank records, withdrawals, dates, amounts, months of quiet investigation. He said he couldn't live knowing his own brother was stealing from us. He wanted to confront Damien immediately. Henry tried to stop him, tried to calm him down, but Richard was determined. And then, Henry whispered, Damien shoved him. Not a struggle, not an accident, a shove. Henry described seeing Richard stumble, trying to regain balance, his face frozen in shock as he realized there was nothing to grab. The scream, the silence afterward. I ran to the edge, Henry said, his voice breaking. I knew he was gone the moment I looked down. Damien collapsed, sobbing, begging. He swore it was an accident. He swore he didn't mean to do it. He promised he would change. And I believed him, Henry admitted, because believing him meant I didn't lose both my sons in one night. I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my temples and into the dirt. You let me mourn a lie, I whispered. I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. He told me how Damien continued stealing, small amounts, quiet transfers, how Henry noticed but stayed silent. Every secret locked him in deeper. I thought if I kept the peace, no one else would get hurt. I was wrong. I forced myself to inhale slowly. That's why he wanted our money now. He's desperate. Yes, his business is collapsing. He owes dangerous people. We were his last option. The truth settled over me like a final blow. My own son didn't just want us dead, he needed us dead. Above us, the sounds of distant voices carried through the gorge, shouting, radios, movement, rescue teams. Damien and Melissa had found help. Henry's hand trembled as he reached for mine. Hilda, when they come down here, everything changes. I swallowed hard. Yes, but only if we survive long enough to tell the truth. Because when the rescuers finally reached us, we had to decide whether pretending to be dead was the only thing keeping us alive.
The voices above grew louder, boots scraping rock, radios crackling, commands echoing through the gorge. Help was finally here, yet terror wrapped tighter around my chest than relief ever could. Hilda, Henry whispered urgently, they can't know we heard anything, not yet. I understood immediately. If Damien and Melissa realized we were alive, and worse, that we'd heard their confession, they wouldn't hesitate to finish what they started. This time there would be no cliff, no accident, just silence. So we stayed still. A rescuer appeared above us, lowering himself carefully with ropes. His flashlight beam swept across the rocks until it landed on Henry's body. "Sir?" the man called out. "Can you hear me?" Henry didn't respond. The rescuer checked Henry's pulse. "He's alive," he shouted upward. "Critical condition." Then the light moved to me. I felt his fingers press gently against my neck, his ear hovering near my mouth. I forced myself to breathe so lightly it hurt. "I'm not sure about the woman," he said. "Pulse is extremely faint." Good. That was exactly what we needed. Medical teams descended quickly after that. I felt hands stabilizing my neck, oxygen placed over my face, straps tightening around my body. Every instinct screamed to open my eyes and cry for help, but I stayed still. Above us, I heard Damien's voice, panicked, trembling, perfectly rehearsed. My parents fell. We were taking photos and the ground just gave way. We tried to save them. Melissa sobbed beside him. We did everything we could. Their lies floated down to us, calm and convincing. If I hadn't lived the truth, I might have believed them. As I was lifted onto the stretcher, pain shot through my body, nearly breaking my resolve. I bit the inside of my cheek to stay silent. The ascent felt endless. When we reached the top, the air felt different, brighter, louder, full of movement and urgency.
I heard Melissa crying dramatically, people offering comfort, calling her brave. Brave. The word nearly broke me. We were rushed into a helicopter. The sound of the blades drowned out everything else. Paramedics focused on Henry first. His injuries were worse than mine. "He's unstable," one of them said. "We might lose him if we don't move fast." Fear surged through me. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him to hold on, but I stayed still. In the hospital, chaos took over. Bright lights, rapid footsteps, medical orders barked over my body as I was transferred to an emergency bed. I stayed unconscious. But my body betrayed me. "Her pulse is stronger than expected," a nurse said quietly. "Trauma response," a doctor replied. "It happens. Monitor her closely." Then came the moment I dreaded most. "Can the family see them?" Damien asked. "Yes," the doctor replied. "Briefly." Footsteps approached my bed. I felt Damien's hand close around mine. His touch made my skin crawl. "Mom, if you can hear me, I'm so sorry," Damien said softly. Melissa leaned in from the other side. "You were like a mother to me," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. Then Damien bent closer, his mouth near my ear. "You should have stopped asking questions. Some truths should stay buried, like Richard." My heart slammed against my ribs. A nurse standing nearby froze. I didn't open my eyes. But the nurse had heard everything. Damien pulled away quickly, realizing too late he'd said too much. Melissa ushered him out, whispering urgently. The nurse returned to my bed moments later. I saw her reflection in the monitor screen, wide eyes, shaking hands. She leaned close. "Ma'am, if you can hear me and you're in danger, move your finger." I moved it, once. She swallowed hard. "Move it again if those people hurt you." I did. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm going to get help," she whispered. "You're not alone anymore." For the first time since the fall, hope flickered. Because within minutes, police officers entered my hospital room, and everything Damien believed was buried forever began to surface.
I heard the door open before I saw anyone. Heavy footsteps, controlled, purposeful, the kind of presence that doesn't belong to nurses or doctors. "Ma'am," a calm male voice said, "my name is Detective Johnson. If you can hear me, you are safe now." Slowly, very slowly, I opened my eyes. The ceiling lights burned, but I didn't care. For the first time since the cliff, I wasn't pretending, I wasn't hiding, I wasn't surviving by silence. The nurse stood beside him, her hand trembling as she pointed gently toward Damien and Melissa's direction outside the room. "I heard what he said," she told the detective, "about burying truths, about a brother." Detective Johnson's expression hardened. I swallowed and forced my voice to work. "They pushed us. They planned it." The detective nodded once, already convinced. "We suspected as much, but we need everything. Start from the beginning." So I told him. Richard, the theft, the confrontation, the shove, the cover-up, the will, the pressure, the mountain invitation, the fall. Every word felt like ripping open an old wound, but this time the wound could finally heal. "And my husband?" I asked desperately. "Henry?" "He's alive," the detective said gently. "Critical, but stable. He's asking for you." Relief nearly crushed me. Within the hour, Henry was conscious enough to speak. When the detective asked him if there was any proof beyond testimony, Henry's eyes filled with tears. "My phone," he said hoarsely. "I recorded everything." The room went silent. The detective took the phone carefully, like it was a loaded weapon. "If what's on this matches your statement," he said, "this changes everything." While police technicians reviewed the recording, Damien and Melissa waited downstairs, playing the role of grieving survivors. They had no idea their performance was ending. An hour later, Detective Johnson returned. "It's all there," he said.
Planning, motive, confessions, even discussion about how to explain your deaths. My stomach twisted, but this time not from fear, from justice. "Where are they now?" I asked desperately. "They're in the waiting area," he replied. "Surrounded. They don't know it yet." I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. For 25 years, Damien had lived untouched by consequences. For weeks, he believed our deaths were guaranteed. That illusion was about to shatter. Through the hospital window, I saw police officers move into position, calm, efficient, silent. Damien Black. An officer's voice rang out through the hall, firm and unmistakable. "You are under arrest for the murder of Richard Black and the attempted murder of Henry and Hilda Black." A scream followed. "That's impossible. They're dead. We saw them die." The words echoed down the corridor, captured, recorded, undeniable. Melissa began crying hysterically. "This is a mistake. We're victims." But then Damien turned on her. "You said this would work. You picked the cliff. And you pushed them," she screamed back. "This was your idea." Their alliance collapsed in seconds. The detective returned to my room later, exhaustion etched into his face. "They're blaming each other," he said, "which only strengthens the case." He hesitated before continuing. "There's something else you should know." I braced myself. "Your son was bankrupt, not just struggling, desperate. He owed money to people who don't forgive delays." I felt sick. "Your deaths weren't inconvenient to him," the detective continued. "You were his lifeline. Your inheritance was the only thing that could save him." I stared at the wall, understanding everything at once. Our deaths weren't optional. They were necessary. "And the children?" I asked quietly. "They're safe," he replied. "Social services has them. When you're recovered, you can apply for custody." Tears slid down my face, not from pain this time, but from a promise forming inside me. Damien took everything from Richard. He would not take another generation with him. But just when I thought the nightmare was finally over, the detective revealed one final truth that made my blood run cold. Detective Johnson didn't leave after delivering the arrests. He sat down instead, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression heavy in a way that told me the worst wasn't finished. "There's more," he said. I closed my eyes briefly. I didn't know how much more my heart could take, but at this point, I needed the truth more than comfort. "While we were verifying the financial evidence," he continued, "we uncovered forged documents. Your signature, multiple times." My eyes snapped open. "What kind of documents?" I asked. "Bank access forms, loan guarantees, attempted transfers," he said. "Damien had been trying to gain control of your accounts for months, quietly, carefully." My chest tightened. "He was planning this even before the mountain," I whispered. The detective nodded. "Yes, the hike wasn't impulsive. It was a response. He believed you were getting too close to the truth." A chill ran through me. I thought back to every question I'd asked, every moment of hesitation Damien had noticed, all those careful smiles, all that fake concern. He wasn't protecting us. He was monitoring us. "There's something else," Detective Johnson said. "We recovered a digital recorder from Damien's backpack." My stomach dropped. "He'd been recording conversations with you and your husband, probably to see how much you suspected. In one file, Melissa says, 'We need to act before they go to the police.'" I felt like the floor disappeared beneath me, even lying in a hospital bed. "They were timing our deaths," I said softly. "Yes, very precisely." That night, after the detective left, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady beep of the monitor beside me. Henry was asleep in the next room, sedated, fighting his own battle to heal. I kept thinking about Damien as a child, how I'd kissed scraped knees, helped with homework, defended him when teachers said he was distant or aggressive. Had I missed the signs? Or had he simply learned how to hide better than anyone else? The next morning, my sister Harriet arrived. She looked older somehow, like the weight of the story had aged her overnight. She held my face in her hands and cried without shame. I always felt something was wrong after Richard died. I just didn't know how bad. We talked for hours about Richard, about guilt, about the future, about the children. Social services brought photos later that day. My grandchildren sat in a bland office, confused and scared, clutching stuffed animals too tightly. They keep asking for their parents, the social worker said gently. I nodded. I know. The thought of those children growing up believing lies, believing their parents were victims instead of perpetrators, made my chest ache in a new way. I made a decision right there. I want custody, when I'm able. The social worker smiled softly. That's usually what helps them heal. That afternoon, our lawyer Albert visited, the same man who'd helped us with the will. The case is strong, he assured us, but their attorneys are already trying to negotiate. Negotiate? I snapped. They're claiming emotional distress and financial pressure, he said carefully. They want it framed as a crime of desperation, not premeditation. I laughed, a hollow, broken sound. They bought equipment, chose the location, practiced the story. They rehearsed our deaths. Albert nodded. And that's why your testimony will matter. The word testimony echoed in my mind. Facing Damien in court, hearing his voice again, watching him pretend. It terrified me. But then I thought of Richard, of how he never got a voice, never got justice. I'll testify, I said firmly, for Richard, for my grandchildren, for the truth. Albert squeezed my hand. That courage will change everything. That night, after the hospital lights dimmed, I felt something new settle in my chest. Not fear, resolve. Because surviving the fall wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the fight. And when the trial finally began, I realized facing my son in court would be more terrifying than falling off that cliff.
The day the trial began, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me from the mirror. Bruises had faded, but scars remained, some visible, others carved deep inside. My arms still ached. Henry still walked with a limp, but nothing compared to the weight of what awaited us inside that courtroom. Damien sat at the defense table when we entered. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, there was no shame in his eyes, no guilt, only calculation, like he was still trying to figure out how to win. That hurt more than the fall. Melissa sat beside him, her face carefully composed. She looked like a grieving wife, not a woman who had helped plan her in-laws' deaths. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have pitied her. The prosecutor began with Richard. Photos, bank statements, testimony from financial experts. The jury listened in stunned silence as 25 years of deception unfolded piece by piece. Then Henry testified. Watching my husband recount the night Richard died was almost unbearable. His voice shook as he described following Damien, hearing the argument, witnessing the shove. When he'd admitted he had stayed silent for decades, his shoulders slumped like a man finally surrendering a burden he could no longer carry. I was wrong, Henry told the jury, and my silence nearly cost us our lives. There was no cross-examination crueler than his own conscience. Then it was my turn. As I took the stand, my legs trembled, not from weakness, but from memory. I told the jury everything. The will, the pressure, the mountain invitation, the fall, the whispers in the hospital room. When I repeated Damien's words, some truths should stay buried, like Richard, I saw several jurors flinch. Damien's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. I turned toward my son then, the man I had once rocked to sleep, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed. Damien, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. My son died the night you pushed Richard. What stood behind me on that mountain wasn't family. It was a stranger wearing my child's face. Damien looked away. Melissa didn't. Her eyes hardened as if daring me to continue. The defense argued desperation, financial collapse, emotional pressure. They painted Damien as a man cornered by circumstances. The prosecution responded with evidence. Equipment purchases, recorded conversations, maps of the trail, practice runs, rehearsed statements. This wasn't desperation. It was design. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of waiting, 3 days of sleepless nights, 3 days of wondering whether the truth would finally matter more than blood. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. On the charge of first-degree murder of Richard Black, the foreperson said, "We find the defendant guilty." My breath caught. On the charge of attempted murder of Henry and Hilda Black, guilty. Melissa received the same verdict as an accomplice. Damien didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just stared straight ahead as if the world had finally become exactly what he deserved. The judge sentenced both of them to life in prison without parole. When it was over, Henry held my hand tightly. We didn't speak, we didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, headlines were already forming, but none of it mattered. Richard finally had justice, and we had survived. That night, as we returned home, I realized something quietly, almost gently. I had lost my son twice. Once to a gorge, once to the truth. But the story didn't end with the verdict, because healing, I would soon learn, is its own kind of battle.
The day after the verdict, the world felt strangely quiet. No sirens, no courtrooms, no reporters shouting questions. Just Henry and me sitting in our living room, surrounded by the same furniture, the same walls, the same memories, but everything felt different. Justice had been served, yet peace hadn't arrived. Not yet. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. We moved slowly, still healing, still sore. Henry leaned on his cane as he walked from room to room, touching things as if confirming they were real. The oak table, the framed family photos, Richard's old school picture, still smiling the way he always had. "I should have told you sooner," Henry said quietly, stopping in front of that photo. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. Holding on to anger now felt pointless. We had both paid enough. The grandchildren came to stay with us a week later. They arrived with small bags and confused eyes, asking questions no child should ever have to ask. Why can't Mommy and Daddy come home? Did Grandpa and Grandma do something wrong? I knelt carefully, despite the pain, and pulled them close. "Sometimes adults make very bad choices," I said gently, "and when they do, other adults have to keep everyone safe." They didn't fully understand, but they didn't need to. What they needed was stability, warmth, truth without cruelty. At night, after they fell asleep, Henry and I would sit together in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, but heavy, thoughtful silence. "I keep replaying everything," Henry admitted one evening. "All the moments I ignored, all the excuses I made." "So do I said. "But regret doesn't change the past. Only what we do next matters." The adoption process began soon after. Social workers visited, paperwork stacked up on the kitchen counter, interviews, evaluations, home inspections. It was exhausting, but for the first time in a while, the exhaustion felt meaningful. One afternoon, Harriet came by with old boxes she'd found while cleaning out her garage. Inside were things she'd saved for years, letters, drawings, childhood photos. Richard's handwriting stared back at me from a birthday card he'd written decades ago. "Love you, Mom. I'll always look out for you." I broke down then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly into Harriet's shoulder, as grief finally made room for relief. "He'd be proud of you," she said softly. Weeks passed. Life didn't magically become easy. Nightmares still came. Sometimes I woke up convinced I was falling again. Sometimes Henry sat up gasping, gripping his ribs like the cliff was still beneath him. But slowly, the fear loosened its grip. One evening, as I tucked the children into bed, my granddaughter looked up at me and said, "Grandma, you don't look scared anymore." I froze. "Why do you say that?" I asked. "Because you smile with your eyes now," she replied simply. I turned away so she wouldn't see the tears. Later that night, I sat on the porch with Henry, the stars bright above us, just like all those years ago when we dreamed about growing old together. "We didn't get the future we planned," I said quietly. Henry took my hand. "No, but we got a second chance to do something right." I nodded. For decades, our family story had been controlled by secrets, fear, and silence. Now it would be shaped by honesty, even when honesty hurt. The pain would never fully disappear, but it no longer owned us. And as I watched the light flicker on in the children's bedroom window, I understood something important. Surviving isn't the same as living, and we were finally learning how to live again. But just when I thought the worst chapters were behind us, a letter arrived that reopened wounds I thought had finally healed. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot like any other piece of paper. White envelope, typed address, no return name. I almost threw it away. It wasn't until I noticed the prison stamp that my hands began to shake. Henry was in the garden with the children, teaching them how to plant tomatoes. Their laughter drifted through the open window, soft, hopeful sounds that made the envelope feel even heavier. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. I don't have to open this, I told myself, but I did. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Damien. My breath caught as I read the first line. "Mom, you owe me the truth now." The audacity of it nearly took my breath away. He wrote calmly, deliberately, as if the trial had never happened, as if he wasn't sitting in a concrete cell for the rest of his life because of what he had done. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, he accused. He claimed Richard had provoked him, that Henry's silence proved guilt, that I had chosen sides and destroyed what was left of the family. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. "There are things about Richard you never knew, things that change everything." My fingers tightened around the page. He wrote that Richard wasn't as perfect as we believed, that Richard had been hiding something Damien claimed he'd kept secret out of loyalty. Loyalty. The word made me laugh out loud, sharp and bitter. But doubt crept in anyway, because Damien knew how to plant seeds. He ended the letter with a warning. "You may think this is over, but some truths don't stay buried forever." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't tell Henry right away. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced through memories, arguments I hadn't understood, silences I'd ignored, moments that now felt suspicious simply because Damien wanted them to. The next morning, I showed the letter to Henry. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening with every line. "It's manipulation," he said finally. "That's all this is." "But what if he's right?" I asked quietly. "What if there's something we never knew?" Henry looked at me for a long time. "Hilda," he said gently, "even if Richard wasn't perfect, even if he made mistakes, nothing justifies murder. Nothing." I nodded. I knew that. Still, the letter had done its damage. Later that week, Harriet called. "You won't believe this," she said. "I ran into someone who used to work with Richard." My heart skipped. "He mentioned something about Richard planning to confront Damien over more than just money," she continued. "Said Richard suspected Damien was involved with dangerous people." That night, Henry and I went through old boxes again. Letters, notes, workshop journals. And there it was. A notebook tucked behind old invoices in the workshop. Richard's handwriting. Inside were dates, names, amounts, and one sentence underlined twice. "If I don't tell Mom and Dad soon, this will get someone killed." My hands trembled. Richard hadn't just been trying to protect us from theft. He'd been trying to protect us from something much worse. And Damien knew it. The letter wasn't a warning. It was a threat disguised as doubt.
because once we understood what Richard had truly uncovered, we realized Damien's plan had been far bigger than we ever imagined. The notebook sat between Henry and me on the kitchen table like a live wire. Neither of us touched it at first. We just stared, letting the weight of Richard's final warning settle into our bones. This will get someone killed. He hadn't meant himself. He knew, Henry said finally. His voice was hollow. He knew Damien was in deeper trouble than we ever understood. We spent the entire afternoon going through that notebook page by page. Richard had been meticulous. Dates matched bank statements. Names matched old emails Henry barely remembered. There were abbreviations we didn't recognize, amounts that didn't make sense for simple theft. This wasn't about greed alone. This was about fear. One name appeared again and again. Initials, really, just 2 letters. But beside them, Richard had written, "Violent." "I think Damien owed them," I said quietly. "Not just money, control." Henry nodded, and Richard realized that if Damien couldn't pay, he'd try to use us. The mountain trip, the will, the urgency, it all snapped into focus. Richard hadn't been confronting Damien to expose him. He had been confronting him to stop him. Harriet came over that evening and we showed her the notebook. She went pale as she read. "This explains why Richard wanted to talk to you so badly that night," she said. "He called me too, said he was scared. I thought he meant emotionally." We all sat in silence, the sound of the children laughing in the backyard drifting through the window. The contrast made my chest ache. "If Damien's involved with violent people," Harriet said slowly, "are we still in danger?" That was the question none of us wanted to ask. Henry closed the notebook. "Damien's in prison. Whatever he was part of, he's cut off now." I wanted to believe that, but the letter in my drawer burned in my mind. Some truths don't stay buried forever. The next morning, Detective Johnson returned our call. He listened carefully as we explained what we'd found. When we finished, he didn't speak for a long moment. "This changes the scope," he said at last, "but not your safety, at least not directly." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means Damien wasn't acting alone, but the people he was involved with are already on law enforcement's radar. Richard may have stumbled onto something bigger than he realized." Bigger? The word made my stomach twist. "Should we be worried about retaliation?" Henry asked. "No," the detective said firmly. "Damien's cooperation, or lack of it, is no longer relevant. The case is sealed. You're protected." After the call ended, I stepped outside and watched the children play. My grandson ran toward me, holding a toy car, grinning like the world had never hurt him. Richard had died trying to protect this. Not money, not pride, family. That night, I wrote back. Not to Damien, to myself. I wrote everything I wished I'd said sooner, everything I'd ignored, everything I now understood. I sealed the notebook and my letter together in a fireproof box and placed it in the closet. Some truths need to be preserved, not hidden. Weeks passed without another letter. No calls, no threats. Life continued, slowly, carefully, but forward. One evening, as Henry and I sat on the porch, he turned to me. "Do you regret testifying?" he asked. I thought of Damien's eyes in court, empty, calculating. "No," I said. "I regret waiting." Henry squeezed my hand. "I think Richard would have forgiven us," he said softly, "but I don't think he would have forgiven silence." I looked up at the stars, remembering the cliff, the fall, the darkness, and the impossible survival that followed. Richard's voice had been buried for years, but it had finally been heard. And just when we believed the danger had finally passed, a single phone call proved Damien's reach hadn't ended at the prison gates. The phone rang just after sunset. I remember the timing because I had just finished reading to the children, their heads heavy with sleep, their small breaths finally even and calm.
For the first time all day, the house felt peaceful. Then the phone rang. Henry looked at me from across the room. We both froze. It wasn't fear at first, it was instinct, the kind that forms after you've learned the world can turn sharp without warning. I answered slowly, "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, breathing, measured, intentional. Then a voice I didn't recognize spoke. "You should stop digging," the man said calmly. Richard didn't know when to stop either. My knees nearly gave out. "Who is this?" I demanded, though my voice trembled. "That's not important," he replied. "What is important is that your son made promises he can no longer keep." The line went dead. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. Henry was beside me instantly. "What did they say?" I said, "They know about Richard and Damien." His face hardened. "I'm calling the police." Detective Johnson arrived within the hour, along with 2 uniformed officers. I repeated every word, every pause, every inflection. The detective wrote silently, his jaw tightening as I spoke. "You did the right thing by calling," he said when I finished. "This confirms what we suspected." "What do you mean?" Henry asked. Damien wasn't just borrowing money or stealing to survive. He was laundering it, moving it, delaying consequences. And now that he's in prison, the people he owed want reassurance. "From us?" I asked, horrified. "No," said Johnson firmly. "They want silence." The word echoed in the room. "I won't be silent," I said, surprising even myself. "Not again." Johnson nodded. "Good, because we're not asking you to be." That night, we were placed under temporary protection. Unmarked cars outside the house, officers rotating shifts. The children noticed something was different, but we told them only what they needed to know, that we had visitors making sure everyone stayed safe. Inside, fear wrestled with resolve. I kept thinking about Richard's note. This will get someone killed. He hadn't just been warning us about Damien. He'd been warning us about what Damien was tangled in. The next few days were a blur of interviews and precautions. The detective explained that the phone call wasn't a threat, it was a test. They wanted to see if you'd panic, if you'd back off. You didn't. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he replied, "we use this." The call had been recorded, the number traced, not to a person, but to a network already under investigation. Richard hadn't died exposing a thief. He died brushing against organized violence. And now, unknowingly, so had we. One evening, after the officers had settled into their quiet watch, Henry and I sat at the kitchen table, holding hands. "I'm scared," I admitted softly. "So am I, but I'm not sorry." Neither was I. For decades, fear had controlled us. Fear of losing a son, fear of facing the truth, fear of what might happen if we spoke. That fear had almost killed us. Not this time. "We protect the children. We finish this." Henry nodded. "For Richard." The detective returned 2 days later with news. "The people behind this call are being moved in on. Your information helped accelerate things." I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. "What about Damien?" I asked. Johnson's expression darkened. "He's been cooperative. He knows the walls are closing in." That shouldn't have surprised me. Damien had always known when to switch sides. That night, as I tucked the children in, my grandson asked me, "Grandma, are the bad people gone now?" I brushed his hair back gently. "They're being found," I said, "and that matters." After they fell asleep, I stood by the window, watching the quiet street. Evil doesn't always die when it's exposed. Sometimes it fights back. But this time, it wouldn't be fighting us alone. Because the very next morning, Damien made a choice from prison that would finally reveal just how far his crimes had reached. The call from Detective Johnson came early the next morning. Henry and I were already awake. Sleep had become a fragile thing, easily broken, slow to return. When the phone rang, neither of us jumped this time. We were past shock. "Damien has asked to speak," the detective said without preamble. "Formally, on record." I closed my eyes. About what? I asked, though I already knew. Everything, Johnson replied. Richard, the money, the people behind it, and what he planned to do if you hadn't survived. Henry's hand tightened around mine. Is he cooperating to reduce his sentence? Henry asked. No, Johnson said. There's no deal on the table. This is something else. An hour later, we sat in a small interview room at the station, not to confront Damien, but to listen. A one-way mirror separated us from a recording room where Damien sat alone, shackled, a microphone clipped to his shirt. He looked smaller somehow, not weaker, just emptied. When the recording started, his voice was calm, too calm. I didn't mean to kill Richard, Damien said, but once it happened, everything else became easier. My breath caught. He admitted to the thefts first, how small amounts turned into larger ones, how debts piled up faster than he could hide them. Then he spoke about the men he'd gotten involved with. Not names, not yet. They didn't care about excuses, only results. Money moving, silence kept. He explained how Richard had figured it out, not all at once, but enough to be dangerous. He said he'd go to the police, Damien said flatly. He said he'd tell you. The room felt colder. So I pushed him, Damien went on. I didn't plan to, but I didn't stop it either. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. After that, Damien said, I realized something. No one questioned it. No one looked too close. That's when I knew it could work again. Henry went rigid. The inheritance was supposed to clean everything up, pay debts, close doors. But you started asking questions. Melissa noticed things. Dad got quiet. He paused. So we planned the hike. He said it like someone describing a grocery list. No hesitation, Detective Johnson murmured behind us. None. Damien went on to explain how Melissa helped, how she scouted locations, rehearsed reactions, and practiced crying in mirrors, how the story had been timed down to minutes. Then came the final blow. If they hadn't fallen the right way, I would have made sure they didn't survive the night. The recording ended. The silence afterwards was unbearable. Henry's face had gone pale. I felt hollow, like something essential had been carved out of me. He never saw us as parents, just obstacles, I whispered. Detective Johnson nodded. That's why he's talking now. He knows the organization is collapsing. He wants protection. Witness protection? Henry asked sharply. For himself, not for you. I felt anger flare, hot, sharp, and undeniable. He doesn't get that, not after everything. Johnson met my eyes. He doesn't get to choose, but his testimony could dismantle what Richard stumbled into. Richard. Even in death, my son was still protecting us. Will we have to testify again? I asked. No, Detective Johnson said. But you may be called to make a statement. I will. That afternoon, Damien was transferred to a federal facility. His cooperation became official. Names were exchanged for survival, networks exposed, arrests began quietly, methodically. The danger didn't vanish overnight, but it receded. That evening, Henry and I sat with the children, helping them with homework, listening to stories about school and friends. Ordinary things, sacred things. Later, when the house was quiet again, Henry spoke. I don't miss him, he said softly. Neither did I. I mourned the child he once was. But the man he became had made his choices, and now so had we. Because telling the truth hadn't just saved our lives, it had finished what Richard started. But just when the world finally began to feel safe again, I realized forgiveness might be the hardest battle of all.
The message didn't come through the mail this time. It came through Detective Johnson. He left something for you, the detective said quietly. A recorded statement, not for court, for you. I didn't want it.
Every part of me screamed to refuse, to let Damien's voice fade into the concrete walls where it belonged. But another part, the part that had buried questions for decades, knew this was the last door. And once closed, it would never open again. I agreed. The recording was played in a small, private room at the station. Henry sat beside me, his hand gripping mine like an anchor. Damien's voice filled the room, calm, controlled, familiar. "Mum," he began, "I know you won't forgive me. This isn't about that." I felt my chest tighten. He spoke about resentment, about always living in Richard's shadow, about believing the world owed him what he couldn't earn. He admitted he had planned the mountain trip for weeks, that Melissa had helped, that the will had triggered panic. Then his voice cracked, not with remorse, but with frustration. "I didn't mean for things to get this big," he said. "I just wanted it to stop." That was the moment I understood something devastating. Damien wasn't sorry because of the pain he caused. He was sorry because it failed. The recording ended with his final words. "If I'd known you'd survive, I would have done things differently." The room went silent. Henry stood up slowly. "Turn it off," he said. Johnson complied. I sat there numb, not shocked, not angry, just empty. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. That night, after the children were asleep, I went into the workshop alone. Richard's notebook was still there, locked safely away. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Damien's final message had done something unexpected. It freed me, because any lingering hope that my son might one day truly understand what he'd done was gone, and with it the burden of waiting for him to change. The next morning I made a decision. I wrote Damien one last letter, not to argue, not to explain, just 4 sentences. "You are responsible for your choices. Richard died trying to protect this family. Your children will be raised with truth, not lies. Do not contact us again." I didn't cry when I sealed the envelope. I felt steady. Weeks passed, then months. Life rebuilt itself in quiet ways. School lunches, homework, garden beds blooming again, laughter returning to places fear once lived. Henry healed, slowly but fully, and so did I. Some nights I still dream of falling, but now I always wake up standing, because the hardest truth a mother must sometimes accept is this: you can love your child and still choose the truth over them. Because surviving the fall didn't just save our lives, it taught me that even the deepest betrayals can end with strength, not silence.
The request came through official channels. Damien wanted one final meeting. Not to negotiate, not to confess, to say goodbye. I stared at the paper for a long time. "No," I said immediately. Henry didn't argue. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. Because buried beneath anger, beneath grief, beneath betrayal, there was still a mother, and mothers carry ghosts differently. "I don't want to forgive him," I said quietly into the dark. Henry reached for my hand. "You don't have to." "But I don't want to hate him forever either," I whispered. 2 weeks later, I walked into the prison visitation room alone. Damien looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just reduced, like a man whose world had finally shrunk to the size of his choices. He stood when he saw me. "Mom," he said. I raised a hand. "You don't get that word freely anymore." He nodded. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just didn't want my last memory of you to be silence." I steadied him, this stranger wearing my son's face.
"You killed your brother," I said calmly. "You tried to kill us. You shattered your children's lives." "I know," he whispered. "And still," I continued, "I loved the boy you were. That love doesn't disappear. It just stops protecting you." Tears slid down his face. "I was afraid," he said. "All the time." "So was Richard," I replied, "and he chose to protect. You chose to destroy." I stood. "This is goodbye," I said. "Not because I hate you, but because I choose peace." As I walked out, my steps felt lighter than they had in years. At home, the children were waiting with Henry, a board game spread across the table, laughter already bubbling. Life. Later that night, I stood on the porch and looked up at the stars. We had faced evil. We had survived truth. We had chosen courage over silence. Richard's story no longer ended in a gorge. It lived on, in honesty, in protection, in the children laughing inside. And so did ours. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't revenge. It's choosing to live free after everything tried to destroy you.
Years passed. The world moved on as it always does. Headlines faded. Court records gathered dust. Damien became a name few remembered. But our story didn't end in a courtroom. It ended at a dinner table. One night, as the children, no longer children, laughed over burned bread and school stories, I looked around and felt something settle gently inside me. Completion. Henry caught my eye and smiled. We had survived lies, violence, guilt, and fear. But more than that, we had chosen truth when it mattered most. Richard's notebook remains locked away, preserved, but no longer heavy. A record of courage, a reminder of cost. I sometimes think about the cliff, not with terror, but with gratitude. Because the fall that should have killed us forced the truth into the light, and the truth, no matter how painful, set us free. Because some stories don't end when evil is exposed, they end when truth finally gets to live. If today's story touched your heart or kept you hooked, you can show your love by sending a super thanks. Your support helps me continue creating more powerful life stories for you. Thank you truly for always being so kind and supportive. I can't wait to read your thoughts about the story. On your screen right now, you'll find 2 new stories that I highly recommend, filled with emotions, twists, and lessons. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for many more inspiring life stories. Until the next one, sending you love, respect, and gratitude. See you in the next story.